Hey folks, it's International Master David Pruess here for Chess.com. And today I've got something really exciting to show you, namely a bunch of Endgame highlights. So far we've gotten really good responses for the Endgame videos, people asking for more, so we're going to give you more. I hope you'll enjoy these. I think these are really cool examples. They all come from a thrilling match that was played just 2 days ago on Chess.com between the two rising stars of American chess, Grandmasters Robert Hess and Sam Shankland. Now, these two players are both 20 years old, and Robert Hess has been number 4 or 5 in the country already for a year or two. He's played in a bunch of U.S. championships, finished as high as second place, and played for the U.S. in Olympiads against other countries and so forth. Sam Shankland, on the other hand, a little bit more recent rise, but last year he finished 3rd in the U.S. championships, and his rating is now breaking into the top 10 in the country. These guys played a phenomenal match, 3 hours of speed chess. These matches, by the way, if you don't know about them, if you haven't seen them, if you're missing them, well, basically you're missing out, because these matches have been phenomenal, fun, exciting, thrilling, and this was the 3rd of them, and right now we're trying to hold one every month. So the next one will be on April 28th. You just have to come and watch. It's free. So there's no tricks, no traps. Just come and check it out. So anyway, what I'm going to start with in this video is I'm going to go over 3 examples of Robert Hess's quick endgame calculations. Okay, because something that really struck me during this match was how quickly Hess would take in short sequences of tricky moves in the endgame. And let's just get started, and I'll show you what I mean. In this position here, Hess is playing white, and he's ahead by 1 pawn. However, his pawns on e3 and possibly f4 are in some danger, and his pieces are a little bit tangled or passive, right? Whereas Sam's pieces are very active here. And there's a threat to the queen. She could take on d6, and then after queen takes b2, this knight would be attacked, and white could try and save the knight, and black would probably grab this e3 pawn. But Robert quickly went in for a tactical variation instead. He plays queen d4, and the interesting thing is that tactically this seems to lose. Sam takes on d4, and then takes on f4. And the point is that if Robert takes back on f4, then bishop f4 check wins the knight on c1 and leaves Sam ahead a pawn. So you go from up a pawn, you trade queens, and sack down into being down a pawn. It seems like a crazy blunder. Well, of course, white shouldn't lose here. They could move their king away instead of taking the knight and then play out this endgame with equal material. They would have an outside pass pawn, but they would also have a weak isolated pawn. But Robert has actually predicted this, and look what he does. And these players are playing blitz chess, okay? It's going to be hard to remember as I show you these examples, but they're playing blitz chess. They often have seconds left on their clock during these endgame phases. He just takes, walking right into what Shankland was apparently aiming for. Sam takes check and captures the knight, and now Hess moves the a-pawn. And suddenly we realize, wait, there are only a few squares left that this a-pawn needs to traverse in order to become a queen. Shankland covers the only square he can with his bishop. But after bishop to b6, it's clear that Hess is going to be able to promote this pawn. Well, that it's going to cost the dark squared bishop, right? So that was really an awesome sequence, right? Where it looks like you shouldn't play a certain move, and he just plays it anyway and has, seen an extra couple moves ahead. And, the whole audience was torn back and forth, like, oh no, he threw away his extra pawn. Oh no, he won. So that was a pretty exciting moment. And he finished off this endgame with no trouble. Well, we're going to move on to another example. Okay, so here we are. Robert has his white here. So again, he's up 2 pawns. And it may seem to you like it would not take a miracle for him to win this endgame as white. However, as I recall, he had 11 to 12 seconds on his clock to win this endgame, and there are still some tricks here, but he played this incredibly skillfully, in my opinion. So watch how he converts this. and ask yourself if you would have been able to. First, he attacks the knight that's defending the pawn. That's a good, clear move. And if the knight moves to f4, he can just capture the pawn on g5. g2 will be firmly defended, and there will be no real counterplay for black. The 3 pawns will eventually win this game. So black defends the knight, and now Hess moves his bishop off of the long diagonal where it's defending g2 to d7. Apparently, once again, falling for one of Shankland's tricks. So Shankland sacks his rook, check, and he takes, checks, grabs the rook, and now it seems like he's only up 1 pawn, and there are good drawing chances for black with the active king in the middle of the board. But Hess has calculated this. He moves his king up, attacking this pawn. The black king tries to deflect the bishop and go defend against the passed b pawn, but Hess grabs the pawn on g5, and Shankland can't take the bishop because Hess will take the knight. He has to move his knight, and the bishop comes here. Well, now you might be thinking, okay, now this is pretty easy for white to win. They've got 2 extra pawns and the long-range bishop. White should be able to convert this with no trouble. But look at the resistance which Shankland puts up, with Hess having just seconds on his clock to deal with it. First, he moves the knight to the queen side so the knight can try and fight the b pawn. Now, as the h pawn comes down the board, his king runs back in that direction. And we get to this position here. And h6 is a strong move by Hess because he sees that the king can't move over to g8 because of bishop d5 check, winning the knight. But Shankland plays knight to b6, preventing the bishop from coming back to d5. Shankland's plan is to get his king over to h8. So he gets there. It was impossible to stop it. And now the situation is that if Shankland were ever able to trade his knight for this pawn, sacrifice the knight for the pawn, he'd have a theoretical draw because the bishop and the h-pawn can't beat a king if the bishop can't check the king on that corner square. So if white had a dark squared bishop, he could win this endgame, but with the light squared bishop, he can't win with just an h-pawn. So the king has to switch to the other side of the board. He has to walk into this fork by the knight, checks his way out of the fork, at the cost of sacrificing the h-pawn, right? He's down to his last pawn, but he's calculated that this knight can now not fight against his king and bishop. If it were just the king or just the bishop, the knight could deal with this pawn without trouble, but there it goes. The pawn comes forward. Shankland checks and brings the knight to defend, but Hess is able to just attack the knight with the bishop from here, and Shankland resigned because after knight b8, king c7 will finish it off. So another very tricky sequence for him to deal with there in order to convert that endgame. Okay, so now we come to our third segment for today, for this video. And here Robert Hess has black once again. He's up a pawn. But in this case, he had 6 seconds left on his clock here. 6 seconds with the outside pass pawn, but doubled pawns on the king side with queens on the board means that he's got to keep his king defended against attacks or perpetual checks. So this looks like quite a tricky position he has here to try to win as black. Anything but easy, I would say. Especially with those seconds on the clock. There was no way to imagine that he would be able to convert this. And watch what he did. Check. Seemingly sending his knight into a very, very dangerous spot where Sam can play this move, queen to c1, stopping knight takes e3 check, and cutting off the knight's retreat at b2. And suddenly it's looking like, what is Robert doing? Is he, moving his knight randomly because he's got seconds on the clock, which is what a human would do in this kind of a situation, right? But Hess instantaneously plays this move. Queen c2, because if queen takes queen, he will have knight takes e3 check, forking the king and queen and thus recovering the queen. Well now, okay, if I gave you this tactic in a book of tactical puzzles, you could solve it and you would find this move. I believe you. But he spent 0 seconds on this move. Also, he spent 0 seconds on the previous 2 moves where he was sinking the knight into d1, right? Like this, into this precarious square. So What Robert Hess is telling us is that with 0 seconds of thought time, just moving his mouse as fast as possible, he can see this queen c2 move coming, 3 moves ahead. And, well, as it turns out, Shankland doesn't have any good moves here because queen takes knight is threatened. So he just took, check, here, takes, and Shankland keeps defending because even though now he's down 2 pawns, Hess has now 5 seconds instead of 6 seconds, and still anything could happen, right? I mean, the guy can't see everything without ever actually having time to think about it, right? He must maybe be making random moves, and at some point he'll blunder. So the game goes on. Shankland brings his king out and tries to undermine this knight. And you notice the bad position of Hess's king. This is actually quite a tricky game to convert here. Now watch what he does. Check, check, bringing the king forward, apparently more active, and then, unbelievable, still playing every move instantaneously. He takes on f4, sacrificing his knight. Shankland takes it. He pushes f3, and Shankland realizes that if he cuts off the pawn with his knight, then his king can't catch up with the other pawn. And so Hess will promote a pawn and queen and win. And once again, if you had this in a puzzle book and you were just asking yourself, what should black do here, you might realize that you could safely trade this pawn to avoid the hanging pawn on e5 and hanging knight on d6. But to be playing all these moves in 0 seconds and confidently converting the most tricky of endgames, using tactics with seconds on his clock, was just mind-blowing. So you've got to see it live. I'm just really confident that you would enjoy it. So come check out the 4th Deathmatch in April, the 5th Deathmatch in May, etc. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you around on Chess.com.